signatures and your emails, and be sure to sign up so that we can make sure that everybody's counted. We really want to thank Gloria for coming, and to all of our co-sponsors. So this talk is sponsored by the Gender Working Group, the Migration Working Group, the Center for Mexican Studies, the Chicano Studies Research Center, and the UCLA Program on International Migration. Gloria González-López is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. She conducts sexuality research with Mexican and Mexican immigrant populations, and teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on feminist theory, sexuality, masculinity, and sexual violence. Her work has been published in numerous journals, including the Journal of Marriage and Family, Qualitative Sociology, the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. Her work has also been supported and recognized by many organizations, including the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. Dr. González-López is among some of the very first scholars to interrogate the relationship between gender, sexuality, and migration, social phenomena routinely seen as truly unrelated, but she knew otherwise. In her book, Erotic Journeys, Mexican Immigrants and Their Sex Lives, which won the Distinguished Book Prize from the ASA Sexuality section, she explores the ways in which heterosexual Mexican women and men living in Los Angeles reinvent their sex lives as part of their immigration and settlement experiences. She also co-edited with Ana Louise Keating the book Bridging: How Gloria Anzaldua's Life and Work Transformed Our Own. Her insights have been extremely generative of new avenues of inquiry, inspired those, including myself and many people in this room, who study gender, sexuality, or migration and the relationships between them. And she's also made many interesting contributions that I learned a lot about today on feminist methodology, public sociology, and how to use our knowledge production process to advance social change. And we just are really excited to hear about her new work on the sexual romantic life experiences of adult women and men with histories of incestuous relationships who currently live in the largest urbanized areas in Mexico. So let's all greet Gloria.
Thank you. It's such an honor. It is an honor to be here today. Thank you, Michael, Ruben, for creating a space to have a conversation about sexuality from a sociological perspective. And I want to thank also all of the groups, the Gender Working Group, the Migration Working Group, Mexican American Studies, and other International Institute, the Institute for International Studies, and everyone involved. And thank you everyone for being here with us today. I know that you have options. Today is Friday. You decided to come. So I thank you. And I want to thank all of the people who have been with me along the way as I've been doing, as I've been working on my my professional agenda, my professional development, in particular Abel Valenzuela, and Mignon has been also a wonderful sister who's been with me nurturing our discipline and developing more critical perspectives to look at why we have to study sex if we are in the social sciences. So, incest. And I know that I have 45 minutes, and then we're going to be here until 1:30, right?
Right.
So 45 minutes for my presentation. Is this okay, or should I go more organic? Is this better? No? Microphone? Good. Okay. So, why incest? So it was 2004. I was an assistant professor at UT. I came to UT in 2002. So it's 2004. My book is on its way out with California. My book came out in 2005. So as a very fragile assistant professor, I had a meeting with my tenure evaluation committee and to think about tenure, right? So I came and I had a conversation with these senior professors in our department. So my question was, how many publications do I need, right? So I have the book is coming out with California, I have other publications, so I think I'm in good shape. So how many articles do I need? And they said, no, you don't need any articles. You need to think about the next project. And I was, my next project? He said, yes, you need to think about your next project. If you are going to come up for tenure, something that we need to know is that you have some kind of professional projection, that you have an idea of what you're gonna be doing with your professional life. And I was, okay, I haven't thought about it. I was thinking about tenure, the book plus articles, that's it, right? That was another part of my life, and I wasn't even thinking about the next project. So I set up an appointment with one of my mentors, my mentor, the one who has been taking care of me. So I set up an appointment at ASA, an hour, and I said, I'm gonna have a long conversation about the next project. So I set up the appointment with my mentor at ASA, I think it was here in LA, Anaheim. There was an Anaheim conference years ago. So here I come with, my mechanical pencil and paper to write down notes. So I come, well, I need to have a consultation with you because I need to work on my next project. So she said, Gloria, what is a community that is close to your heart? And I said, well, I have been doing some work with some of the professionals who work in Ciudad Juárez. I have a background as a couple and family therapist. And when I was here in LA, I did some work with women who were refugees, Central American women who were escaping sexual violence. So I did some work with them. So at some point I established a professional relationship with all of these women who were trying to figure out what was happening in Ciudad Juárez. And I became a long-distance volunteer, and this was kind of on the side. I wasn't writing about what was happening, and this was a relationship I established in 2000. And so I would go to Ciudad Juárez, and I would give workshops on feminist theory, gender inequality, etc. But I never got to write about what was happening in Ciudad Juárez. And it was too close to me. I was doing my good sex and gender and sociology kind of thing, right? And I wanted to get tenure. So this was kind of on the side. But it was a legitimate relationship. So my mentor is asking me, so what is a community that's close to your heart? I said, well, Ciudad Juárez. And she said, what is urgently needed in Ciudad Juárez? And I said, I don't know. And she said, you go and ask. And I go, okay. Is that the conversations, that the question that you had about your next project? And I said, yeah. I said, go and ask. Okay, so it took like 5 minutes. That was my long conversation at ASA, right? 5 minutes. So I found myself buying a ticket, Southwest Airlines, go to El Paso, cross the bridge, Ciudad Juárez. So I established a conversation with the professionals, the activists who have been working there. And I told them, you know that I have been doing all this work on sexuality, gender. I'm a sociologist. I'm concerned about, creating a bridge between what we do in, academia and also communities, etc. So I'm here because I want to know what's urgently needed, right? And I started to listen to them, and they said, Gloria, we have all of these people who are doing research about all of these women who have been killed, and we have all of these, we have lots of people who come to Ciudad Juárez to investigate. So we have a lot of people doing that kind of thing, But we have learned that a lot of sexual violence happens within families. And we don't know why. We go through our training, and I listen to different psychologists, social workers. We go through our training, and there are no publications on, people who have these kinds of histories here in Mexico. We don't know why that happens. And I was like, wow. Then I listened to other people, and they said, no, I think that sexual violence in families, sexual violence by relatives. So people were telling me incest, right? And when I published, erotic journeys, I interviewed people who told me that they had been exposed to these kinds of experiences. But back then, when I did all of the work, in late 90s, I don't think I was ready. Emotionally, professionally, personally, I wasn't ready. And I think that at this point in my life, I was ready, finally. And then it was coming from the communities, right? It was coming from the communities. So I said, well, it seems like incest is the topic. So then I immersed myself in the literature, and then I learned that, in fact, there was no empirical research on incest in Mexican society. So I said, okay, so now I need to go and do my field work. And so I requested funds. The Woodrow Wilson Foundation was just so remarkably supportive. I got funds also from UT. So I spent a year and a half, 4 semesters in Mexico. And I spent a semester in Ciudad Juárez in 2005. I spent another semester in Mexico City, another one in Monterrey and Guadalajara. So I interviewed a total of 60 people, adults with histories of incestuous relationships, women and men, mostly women. I interviewed about 45 women, 1 transgender woman, and then the rest biological men, 14 men. And again, as it happened to me with the previous project, I found myself, conducted really long, in-depth interviews with all of these women and men who had histories of incestuous relationships. I have a couple of publications where I discuss all of the lessons that I learned about, doing the ethnographic work, because I thought that as a professor and as someone who had a PhD, I had some kind of legitimacy to do this kind of work. And then when I introduced myself to all of the professionals who work at all of these community-based agencies to recruit potential informants, I ended up being interviewed by the people who qualified for the study. And that was very humbling, right? Like, who am I, right? So it was very powerful. And it helped me tremendously also to make sure that people felt safe to be interviewed. So I identified all of these women and men at community-based agencies in all of these cities. Women's groups also helped me tremendously, activists. And also there's the institutes that offer services to women. We call them the Instituto Estatal de las Mujeres. So these are state funded, groups, institutions, and they helped me tremendously. So at all of these places, that was the way in which I identified informants. So as I went through, my ethnographic journeys, in each one of these locations, I learned tremendous, important methodological lessons. And maybe when we have the Q&A or the dialogue, I would be happy to answer some of these questions. But what I would like to share with you today is some of the most relevant findings, which were, very shocking for me. And one of them is this idea that came up, which took me by surprise, which is the ways in which immigration shapes also sexual violence within families. So as I was also conducting my interviews, I interviewed professionals. I interviewed attorneys, social workers, priests, therapists, and other activists who had some kind of interest in these kinds of topics, and who had done some work as well with people who had some kind of history of sexual violence. So it was really refreshing to get the perspective of people who have been doing all of this work out in the trenches. And it was actually really enlightening for me when I analyzed the data. The most relevant findings. When I was there, when I was in Mexico City, I met a group of professionals who have been working for a very progressive, pro-Catholic organization. And they asked me, they said, Gloria, are you going to interview men who have been sexually abused by priests? And I said, oh, no, this is incest. This is, this happens within the family. They said, it would be great if you could talk to 2 men who were sexually abused by the Padre Maciel. Some of you may know, Father Maciel. And I said, well, wow, it would be great to interview, some of the survivors, so 2 Maciel survivors. And so I interviewed them. They were in their 60s, close to being 70, and they were sexually abused by him when they were seminarians, when they were adolescent. And so the idea was, why do I have to listen to, men who have been abused by priests, if this is about family? So when I listened to one of them and I told him about the project, he said, Gloria, Maciel was like a father for me. He in a way, played that role of my father. So I think that in a way, what he did to me definitely had a very profound impact, because I saw him as my father, and the other men that I interviewed, he told me the same. So I learned that, he explained to me that this idea of incest, as I've been trying to define incest, for some people, it is also redefined by what people understand as family. So what is family? Also the definition of family. So the definition of incest and the definition of family, both were redefined. So this particular person said, he was like a father. So I think that it was some kind of spiritual incest. It was really deep. And then I had some kind of relationship as well with the church as La Madre Iglesia, so the church is in a way like a mother. So he was kind of shaking me up conceptually, because I had my really nice, neat definition of family, right? So as all of this is happening, and I'm listening to them, so now we have spiritual incest, now, what's family? I was also confronted by some people, especially, in Guadalajara. I was invited by the Radio Universidad. It was a radio station that is based at the University of Guadalajara, and they invited me to facilitate a conversation on sexual violence and incest twice, and then they gave me an hour the second time. But people would call and ask questions, And so you have, la doctora que estudia el incesto, so I was so interested to have this, on the radio. And so here I am, I wasn't expecting that, so that was a kind of a surprise, as part of the ethnographic experience. So people would say, this happened to me with a man who was the brother of the husband of my mom's sister. And I was like, huh? So this is not the biological uncle, but él era mi tío, he was my uncle. Does that count as incest? Is that incest or not? And I was like, well, what about you? What do you think about it? Well, I think that's incest. So what's family for you? And I was like, wow, what's family for me? So this idea of family was redefined, as I was collecting my data. It's so interesting because the grounded theory, as an approach, is just so evident in this project. And also the other, the other finding, the other relevant finding was the following. So in Mexican society, when we think of the different regions, the idea of family, what counts as family? Who is family? And I thought about the ways, or I learned about the ways in which our cultural construction of family may make people vulnerable to experience, these forms of sexual violence. So I learned, for instance, in Ciudad Juárez, with some of the women that I interviewed who work at the maquila industry. And then through other women who knew women who work at the maquila industry, that they would establish a relationship with a man that they just met. And then automatically, if they establish a cohabitation relationship with them or marry them after a short term relationship, then automatically he may become the uncle, or he may become the husband of so-and-so. So then people they may barely know, because they get married, then this person becomes family automatically. And the fact that you are family, then you are morally equipped to take care of children. When in fact, they may not know you well, So I thought it was just so interesting how this openness, which in other contexts could be celebrated, like oh, we're all family, this is wonderful. But then when you think of the implications of who counts as family and who doesn't count as family, how that may make children vulnerable. So I thought that was really fascinating. How this idea of family, what's family as a concept. And I kept thinking about Judith Stacy, the postmodern family, and the ways in which we're being more and more creative. And then the idea of incest, as well, because here I include both voluntary and involuntary, and it came from people as well. People who would say, well, what happened with my cousin, it wasn't by the force, but what happened with my uncle was against my will. So so which one counts? No, share, all of it, But it was just so interesting, depending on what how the person experienced then this, if it was voluntary or involuntary or somewhere in between, then it would shape this kind of perception. The other, the other really relevant finding for me was, and I'm working now on the book, so I'm going to share with you, about how I'm organizing the book. Okay, so should I take the floor?
If you want.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's empowering. And I know that, there's a lot of work, so I'm sorry. Is that okay? So am I okay then? Okay. Okay. I give my lectures in class, so this is more empowering. So I analyzed, and and I'm thinking about the ways in which I'm organizing the book, which is something I'm working on now. It's a project, is my project at this moment. The most relevant findings. Something that I did was to analyze the ways in which people would report to me. Like women would tell me, well, it happened with my dad, it happened with my brother, it happened with my uncle. Or it happened with an amigo de la familia who was like an uncle. And then people would ask me, is that incest or not? Well, he was like an uncle, but he was a friend of the family. So, so I discuss all those things. I'm going to discuss all those things in the book. But then you would have a person who experienced different forms of sexual violence by different relatives, right? So it's really interesting, all of the patterns, that I find. At times you would have someone who was only abused by dad or a brother, but at times you have multiple experiences. And then also something else that I learned is that it happened across generations, and that it was not just one case, one isolated case in the family, but different cases, different patterns, family patterns. So it would happen to the person that I interviewed, but then it happened to her sister, it happened to mom, it happened to grandma, it happened to different women in the family, or boys, or their children. So I came up with the concept of family constellations of sexual violence to explain all of these, patterns, family patterns across generations. So as I am analyzing, all of these patterns, I look at the stories of women in terms of the father-daughter. I look at the father-daughter relationship. I look at the sister-brother. I look at the prima-primo. I look at the niece-uncle. And I look at the granddaughter-grandpa. So all of these arrangements, that's what I am going to, that's what I examine in the book. And then men stories, which are, really fascinating. Because I also interviewed, some of the gay men that I interviewed have quite revealing, dynamics. And then, of course, I'm going to share about the transnational perspective, and I'm going to share some other dynamics. So first, what I want to share with you is what I learned from the women who were abused by dad, by dad. So I analyzed all of these stories, including stories of women whose fathers were religious men. I interviewed a woman who was the daughter of a Catholic priest. A Catholic priest who had established a relationship with a woman. He had a mistress, and then they had children. So he sexually abused one of their daughters. I'm actually working on the article on that one. It's a very interesting case. So, but I'm going to share more with you about what I've learned. What are the sociological lessons? How can you explain this? Why does it happen? So as I'm looking at the stories, and I don't use any of the software to analyze qualitative data. I do it old-fashioned. I read the interviews. I do the categories, note cards, move them around and everything. I mean, I really immerse myself in the data. So, and I know that some people use the nudist or whatever, which is great, but I do it old-fashioned, and so I develop a really close intellectual relationship with all of these interviews. But what I learned about the women who had this history of incestuous relationship with dad, what does that happen? Something that I learned was, so these are the main concepts that explain the father-daughter incestuous relationship. First, these women were some of you may know the concept of the parental child. Parental child is the oldest child, at times it's the oldest child, not always, but it's the child who replaces mom in some of the family-related responsibilities. Some of us, there's research on this. The child, mom has to work, dad has to work, so this is the oldest child who would take care of the children, right, to make sure that they eat, maybe bathe them, etc. So what I learned is that these women who have been sexually molested by a father, were the parental child who has become sexualized. So this is the daughter who is not only the parental child, but she also plays the function of mom. So she's the sexualized parental child. So she's replacing mom. Besides, all of these responsibilities, she's replacing mom in terms of the relationship, in terms of the sexual relationship, and also the romantic relationship. All of the women that I interviewed, they came from families where the couple had some kind of tension, unresolved problem, etc. So then these women, as daughters, they were playing a role as a substitute of mom. There's a really, all of the cases are just so fascinating, but there's a case, and this comes from Ciudad Juárez, and I want to share this with you because it's linked to another concept. I interviewed this woman who was in her 20s in Ciudad Juárez, and her father was a cab driver, and she told me that when she was in elementary school, so I interviewed her in 2005, she's in mid-20s, so she's in elementary school, and she would come, after school, she would come home and have lunch, and then dad would come out of his night shift as a cab driver, and then she would listen to dad talking to mom about how awful life is in Ciudad Juárez. Cab drivers are being killed, there's a lot of violence, etc., etc. So he is, he's distressed, lots of anxiety, etc. And then she's explaining to me, and then after lunch, dad would take me to take a nap with him. And then she said, and you know what, those naps didn't feel good. So I asked her, would you please explain to me what your dad did to you? And she said, you know what, he didn't get me naked or did anything to me, sexually speaking, but the way he touched to me didn't feel right. I felt as if I was an extension of my mom, as if I was substituting my mom. So I learned that in this particular case, because both parents had a very challenging marital relationship, she was replacing mom in that role, right? So dad was taking care of his anxiety, etc., tension, because he lives in Ciudad Juárez, and soothe himself through his daughter instead of doing that with his wife, right? Because that's what you do when you have a relationship, right? That's the closeness, intimacy, etc. And then she said, but I felt so much for my dad because he was going through all of this, and I never told my mom about it, etc. So then when she's explaining all of this to me, and I'm trying to make sense of this, the concept, as a good sociologist, the concept that came to mind was, well, this doesn't happen in a social vacuum. This is quite complex. This is really complex. And then I'm going to give you more examples of the following. But the concept of structural incest came to mind, right? So then the marginality, poverty, whatever is happening socially speaking, is in a way the context that facilitates. And something that I'm, working on now that I'm, organizing all of these ideas for the book, is how to think about vulnerability. What are the ways in which, or what are the factors, the social forces that make people vulnerable to, sexual violence, especially sexual violence within the family. So this is the sexualization of the parental child, and this idea of structural incest was, in a way, helped me to understand, what was happening. With regard to structural incest, another pattern that I found in Ciudad Juárez was the following. Some of the women who work at the maquila industry, who don't have child care support, who, the maquiladoras don't offer that in general, I learned that some of these women who have to make quick decisions because, the shift, overnight they tell them that, you have to come and work. They would leave their children, they would leave like 2-3 of their children at home alone and lock them up. And then the oldest one, who perhaps had a history of, sexual violence, might abuse the little one. So I learned that through some of the women that I interviewed, and I thought it was so interesting. So it's the structure, right? So the concept of structural incest is something that I have been developing, to explain all of this. So the going back to the father-daughter incestuous arrangement, and trying to make sense of this. The other thing that I learned, the other dynamic that I learned was the following. In Mexican society, and we have this also in other societies, but we know that in families, girls are trained to serve their brothers, to serve men, to cook, to clean, wash the dishes, etc., right? And what I learned is that in these incestuous families, they may cross, this girl, especially the men, they may cross those fine lines and expect to be served sexually as well. So the concept of gendered servitude is something that is a concept that I am developing to understand the ways in which these girls have a sexual function within their families. And I'm going to share about, how the brother-sister relationship is also part of this. So as I was trying to understand the father-daughter relationship, something that I learned is that in some of these families, some of these men, especially the fathers, have been socially trained to perceive their families as if they were hacienda owners. So if men are trained to believe that the family is like an hacienda, right? So the family is like an hacienda, and I own the hacienda. I thought about the concept that some of you may know, el derecho de pernada, the right to the first night, which comes from medieval Europe. Back then, this is prior to the expeditions of, Christopher Columbus, men who used to own the land, they also had the right to have sex with the women who lived in a specific territory, the territory that they used to own. And that was established also here in Latin America. And in Mexico, we still have some expressions of the el derecho de pernada. So when I was thinking about this, was precisely that if men, in these patriarchal families, men are trained to believe that they can manage or perceive their families as something they own, which goes hand in hand also with the idea of children as property. We own our children, our wives, and this comes from Marx and Engels as well. Then I have the right to a woman's body, so I have the right to my daughter's body, right? The other thing, as I was thinking, so what happens to mom? So what happened to mom? So I understand that if she is being sexualized as a parental child, and then she's playing all of these functions, so what happened to mom? Well, what I learned is the following. There's some kind of, what I discovered is that there's some kind of kinship reassignment, So then the parental child who is sexualized becomes the wife, and then the wife becomes one of the children. She's infantilized. Mom becomes one of the children, one of the daughters, completely disempowered, invisible, no authority, etc., etc. So then there's some kind of reassignment that is just so powerful. So now you have the daughter who's sexualized, and then mom is desexualized. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. When I interviewed an attorney, and this blew me away. I interviewed an attorney, and she told me about a case that she handled. And so dad goes to prison because he abused one of his daughters, so he goes to prison. And then when he's in prison, apparently he didn't get what was happening. He didn't get why he went to prison. Because when they had the conjugal visits, when the partner can come, the wife is supposed to come, when they have the marital visits or conjugal visits in prison, he told his wife to bring his daughter to have sex with him. This is the very same daughter that he sexually abused. He said, I have my conjugal visits, bring, the girl. Isn't it something? I mean, it's just so shocking. It's just really shocking when you think, in those terms. So it is just so fascinating how then there's this kind of kinship reassignment. It's just so interesting. And there was another case. It was the same attorney who told me about a case that was really interesting and really very, very sad as well, about a father who had, I think, 4 daughters, and each one of them had a specific responsibility. So one of them did the cooking, the other one did the cleaning, then the other one did the grocery shopping, and the other one slept with him. And then mom did one of those things as well, So it's just so shocking and interesting. In this project, I also look at how these men, the other thing that was just so fascinating is that these men, and this challenged my own prejudices, these men were not necessarily physically aggressive, or physically violent. These were men who were hardworking, loving, went to church, helped the priest, made contributions to the church, were charismatic. These were really sophisticated men. And something that the women told me was that one of the reasons why at times they would be silent and they wouldn't share with other people was precisely because they were afraid that people would not believe them. My dad was such a good man, they are not gonna believe me. Or my uncle, it was the case, my uncle. So it was just so fascinating how, like some of the myths, some of the misconceptions we have with regard to sexual violence, well, now I know, sexual violence within families, that is not this ugly, aggressive, completely negative, image of masculinity. These are actually really sophisticated expressions of masculinity. And that is why that makes it's part of the reproduction of this, because it's quite sophisticated, then it reproduces the cycle. And I interviewed someone in Monterrey who belongs to an upper middle class, and she told me that she was almost convinced that her father was involved in drug dealing activities, and that people in her colonia talked about her dad being involved in drug dealing activities. But then he was always dressed up, expensive car, and would help the church with lots of money. So it was someone who was really charismatic. And finally, when they learned about what he had done to her and also her sisters, it became a scandal. So it's really it's really fascinating. I'm thinking of Irving Goffman. How the backstage, front stage. How people may play. This really sophisticated construction of the self. How these men may construct these dynamics that are so fascinating. I need to be mindful of time. So, wow, what happened? It's 12:45 already, and I'm really beginning. So then I also discovered that some of the father-daughter relationship, some mothers facilitated these instances of abuse, sexual abuse. And what I learned is that in these cases were men who were religious men, the Catholic priest. There was another case of a minister, a Protestant minister, and another man who did witchcraft, a brujo, who was involved in all of these activities. And then again, they were not necessarily, men who are physically aggressive, etc. But then something that was so fascinating is that these moms who facilitated these encounters, they were dealing with their own challenges in the relationship. So then they were using their daughters to cope with their own disempowerment. So, but then it was arranged at times with dad. So then I realized that daughters may become marital servants. They may serve the marital relationship. So that they might be used not only by dad, but my mom as well. So then this idea of the pater familias, dad owning both mom and children. And then as I did more research, I learned that the Latin origin of for the word slave was famulus. It's just so fascinating when you think of familia, how romantic it is, right? It's romanticized. And then when you do some digging and learn that, that it comes from this Latin origins in terms of, how the family, especially the pater familias, were under the authority of, men. And then this, of course, is an answer to this idea of how daughters may become sexual slaves or marital servants, as I explained. So then what about the brothers? What about the brothers and sisters? I think the most relevant finding was exactly the same thing, that these brothers were not necessarily aggressive. These brothers were not necessarily physically violent. And these brothers could actually be very seductive. They could be very charming. They could give gifts to their, sisters. Usually it was a brother who's a teenager and then a sister who's in elementary school. And so what I learned as I'm, looking at all of the interviews and looking at the brother-sister arrangement is that these daughters or these sisters, now we're talking about sisters, became the sex surrogates of their brothers. So they become, what I learned is that these men would use their sisters as a way to train themselves, sexually speaking, and as a way to initiate themselves into manhood. So what I learned is that in patriarchal society, and I'm thinking about patriarchal Mexico, if we give dolls to girls to play and to learn, about heterosexuality, becoming moms, etc., brothers have their sisters. And this incestuous families, what I've learned is that the sisters become like their sexualized dolls with whom they are going to initiate themselves into, hetero manhood, into how to seduce women, relationships, and to also get their very first lessons about what Connell identifies as the patriarchal dividend, So it's the incestuous relationship becomes some kind of socialization of what it means to be a heteropatriarch, and training. So the other concept that I use here is also the idea of sexual continuum. Liz Kelly, a sociologist, a British sociologist, she has a really critical perspective, a really interesting perspective of the following. She says, if we look at rape and we look at how heterosexuality has been constructed, there's a lot of parallels. The ways in which heterosexual relationships are established have a lot of commonalities with how women are raped. There's some kind of violence, there's seduction, etc. So some of the women that I interviewed, and I'm thinking about one woman in particular who was sexually abused, who was in Mexico City, abused by her brother. She told me that her brother was a really good lover. And I was like, wow. I mean, I'm listening, right? I had my wow inside and silent. Right? And can you explain that for me? And she said, yeah, my brother, when he tried to abuse me, I put some resistance, and he was very respectful. And he was very caring, even though I was, concerned. But, he really cared about how I felt. So that's just so confusing, But then it tells you that, these girls are the sex surrogates, These men are training themselves to know how to, lead a relationship. And I also came up with this conclusion when I asked the women, so when did your brother stop harassing you? And women would say, well, I noticed that stopped when he found this woman, a girlfriend. So it was just a really interesting transition, that the abuse or the molestation stopped precisely when he established a relationship with a girl, right, with someone who's not in the family. And the other one with the cousins, with las primas. Something that I learned, which is so interesting that I was aware of this, but I had never examined this. We have within families, especially within extended families, so these are the cousins, las primas and primos. Some of you, maybe are familiar with the expression, a la prima se le arrima. You can be, maybe, Ruben, you're familiar with the expression, maybe you heard that in Mexico. Yeah. Isn't it interesting? So you can get physically, sexually close to your cousin, female cousin. It's just so interesting. So I was just like, where does that come from? So some of the women that I interviewed who were sexually harassed by their cousins, these experiences happened when they were children. So they are, elementary school. The girls are in elementary school, and the boys are older. And this happens in groups. And there was a particular case in Guadalajara where this woman, for about 40 years, every time she visited grandma, her primos would be there, and they would harass her in front of other authority figures, of the family, tias, etc. And nobody would do anything. So this is just so similar about, I'm thinking about street sexual harassment. How women are harassed, or some social groups are sexually harassed, but you just take it for granted, right? So that's the way it is. So something that I learned is that all of these practices or all of these expressions of sexual harassment that are normalized trivialized, that have become invisible. We need to name them. We need to identify them, to deal with them. So my little contribution here, or a way in which I try to explain this, is that if we could use the concept of family sexual harassment to identify, these ways in which girls are sexualized within families, then we would be able to intervene. Because, this particular woman that I interviewed in Guadalajara, she was sexually harassed by, her cousins in front of, other women in the family. Nobody would do anything. So then this idea of children also being asexual, they are just playing, And as I was trying to make sense of this, also sociologically, is the ways in which we have become culturally helpless. There's some kind of cultural helplessness. Boys will be boys. Así son los hombres. Oh, no le hagas caso. That's the way men are. Don't pay attention to him. He's just playing. And how it has become normalized. So now, as all of this, as I've been trying to make sense of all of this, and as I was doing my interviews, one of the patterns that, of course, came up, and this is the one when I was, I don't do quantitative research, but I was looking at, how many. And the one that was the most relevant one in terms of all, frequency, was the niece-uncle. So there's a lot of uncles, lots of uncles, in the study. Lots of uncles with women and men as well. All of these uncles who harass the girls or boys. And it was a maternal side. So the uncle was on maternal side. And we could have a conversation about, why that was the case. So when I interviewed this woman who told me that her uncle, when she's between the ages of 12 and 15, her uncle, this is mom's brother, would harass her, and he was already in his 20s, would harass her continuously and try to kiss her, try to embrace her, etc. He assaulted her, sexually, etc. And finally he left. So he came to the U.S. So she's like, oh, finally my uncle is gone. The problem is solved. Guess what? No, it didn't stop there. So now that he was on the American side, he would call her, and over the phone, he would harass her. And or he would visit, and then that would continue. And I was just like, wow, that's just so fascinating. So I interviewed an attorney in Guadalajara to ask her about all of these things, because this is an attorney who's based in Guadalajara. She's been working for a long time with cases of sexual violence, and she's been working with immigrant families. And I told her, what do you think about this? And she said, Gloria, that's very common. And I was like, what? As a good researcher, always like, I didn't know that. I haven't thought about it. And she said, that's so common. And I said, really? She said, yes. That's very common that, and you have different patterns. So she explained to me, you could have that the children are here, in Jalisco, and then the uncle is abusing, one of them, and then he may leave to the American side as a way to, escape, to run away from the family, punishment, etc. But then he's there, but then the children may visit, and then he may do it to the children, or then if the children are here and then he comes back, then he may continue with this. And she said, that happens all the time. And I was like, wow, that's so prevalent. She said, yes, that happens all the time. So I thought about, the woman who had, this particular situation with her uncle, who would harass her on the phone. And then the situation is that she's not telling mom about it, because then she's afraid that she's not gonna believe, etc. And then, so mom would tell her, oh, habla con tu tío, talk to your uncle, he's such a good man, Pobrecito. He's in the U.S. You should talk to him. What did he do to you? So it's just so interesting. The other idea that I'm trying to understand in my work is how silence is socially organized. That's part of all of this. I am not going to discuss silence in the book because it's huge, but I explore the ways in which and the reasons why people wouldn't talk about it. It's really interesting, of course, it's quite fascinating. But that's something that I'm barely kind of, opening up. So the transnational incest, and I want to know your opinion about this as someone who has been, studying immigration for a long time, Ruben. I try to make sense of this, how do you explain this? How do you explain these patterns, And this is an idea that I'm working with and that I am exploring and that I would like to, study in more depth because this has implications in terms of policy, in terms of how we, work on, these issues at, different levels, etc. But I thought it was quite revealing. It was something that was really powerful. So in the book, in my book, I have, all of these, different chapters. I have two good sociological chapters on, everyday life and how, incest is part of everyday life in some of these families. All of the good, sociological, cultural analysis. I have all of this, So, and I have the first chapters are more, what I'm following more now is different than the first book, is on analyzing the stories. So I tell the stories. And also because as a qualitative researcher, I became a witness. So for me, it's important to give the details of all the, what people share with me. So I feel some kind of, we were talking about intellectual responsibility, right? So early today. So, just to, methodologically speaking, share all of those details. And that's what I'm doing. And, chapter 1 about the father-daughter, 2, brother, sister, and cousins, 3, the uncles, nieces, and grandpa. And then the other chapter is about men, because some of the men that I interviewed were what they are identified, quote unquote, as perpetrators. So some of these are the stories of the men who went through both, who were sexually abused, but then who also exercised violence. And then I have the other chapters are about the more sociological analysis. I have a couple of chapters. And then the last chapter, which I hope, and maybe the second way to wrap it up and then to open up, for a Q&A or a conversation. The stories, the other side of, the pain, the other side of all of this pain. I interviewed people who have never been in therapy, who went through really painful, challenging experiences. And I interviewed someone in Ciudad Juárez who was just a stable, productive, happy person who has never been in therapy, who told me that an awful story, her biological father raped her when after she had her quinceañera, really intense, really bad. And she's telling me the story, she is in pain, but is very moderate. I think I am the one who's really like, in pain, and she's, articulate, stable, really, really wonderful. And I'm like, really, wow, what's going on? And then she's telling me, I don't feel like I'm traumatized. Do you think I should be traumatized? And I said, no. This is, no. I mean, I'm here to learn, right? So, and I go like, so why do you think you're not traumatized? And she said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, let's do research together. Let's get inside your heart and let's see what's going on, right? So she told me that she talked to someone in a school counselor, and her school counselor told her, well, how do you feel about, talking to mom? And told her the story and everything. And so she finally talked to mom. And this is what I learned the lesson. So she said, my mom talked to my dad in front of me, and she kicked him out of the house.
And she what? Kicked him out of the house.
She kicked him out of the house, So she told my dad, cursing, I'm not going to tell you the language, but in Spanish, and, you get out of this house. Why did you do that to my daughter? You're gonna get out of here, you get your stuff, and you go away. So she told me, when I'm listening to that, I was like, my mom believed me. So she told me, you know what? I think the reason why this did not affect me is because my mom believed me. And my mom took action. So I was just like, mom believes, and mom took action. So then I interviewed more people who had a very similar pattern. And I learned that in some instances, an older, sibling or grandpa or an older, someone who represents authority in the family, who would learn about the experience, believed the story and offered support to the child and intervened. And I learned that this kind of intervention, this kind of reaction became a protective factor from trauma. Because I interviewed other people who went through really ugly experiences, but then they talked to someone and the person believed them. The person intervened. So I was like, bing. So adults who believe to those children and who intervene, if the child is witnessing this, there's some kind of, there's a protection. There's a protection from trauma. And two, there's some kind of sense of family justice, And when I was interviewing this woman in Ciudad Juárez, she said, wow, so my mom saved me many years of psychotherapy. And I said, definitely. And I learned from other people who had, the same stories. So I just wanted to share this with you and to end on this note, like a more happy note, to think about the ways in which, this kind of research in a way, goes back to the community, because now with all of these findings, especially the last one, I have gone back to, these different community-based agencies, and I have given workshops to the way I'm sharing with you. And I've been sharing with professionals, again, activists, all of the people who helped me. And I've been sharing with them, and they said, oh, this is really good because we give, workshops to children or the PTA meetings or whatever, and we can share your findings. So this is a way to give back, right? Mm-hmm. Like when my mentor told me, what's urgently needed. So I hope that, this could be used. And some people have told me that they are already using it. So I'm gonna stop there, this note of hope and possibilities to intervene, and also to make a difference, even if it is modest. As public intellectuals, as feminists in action, as we create those bridges and do work, as Gloria González, I would say, work that truly matters. So thank you for listening, and now let's see. So now let's engage in a conversation. Mignon.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. So many things I would like to ask. But one thing I just want to ask you more about the thing that you said you were not ready to share so much on, which is the silence, because of the way you ended your talk. And so it was the voice that helped, and as you shared your really interesting stories and important stories, what continually came up was not telling, right? The silence either of the child or of the mother in her own complacentness or her own issues, and each time the silence was there. And so I'm wondering how you're going to be able to finish this very important work without dealing with it.
Yeah, Mignon, you know what, for the book, so I'm working on the book that I described for you. And then I was thinking about the audiences, who's my audience, right? Because the people that I interviewed told me, they said, so are you writing a book for whom? And I go like, I'm thinking about like, full professor, and then of course I'm thinking about like not just me, right?
Yeah.
Not just me, because if I'm actually, I identify myself as a feminist, and aware of all of these wonderful things that we've learned from all of these wonderful scholars. then what is the kind of work that I want to publish, right? So there's the book, right? Family Secrets, Secretos de Familia. But then I was thinking that, and this is a great question, Mignon, and I appreciate it, because I was thinking about, writing a book, a small book, a short book about silence, just silence, making sense of silence sociologically. So that's a book that I would love to write, and it doesn't have to be long. And I'm actually thinking about the audience. What would be the audience of the book? But definitely, I mean, the whole thing on silence, making sense of silence sociologically. Like when I ask those questions, and I still have to analyze the data, like why you don't tell anyone? And something that I learned is that, well, you know what? I don't know, but, and I was like, okay, so let's find out why, and I'm like a good researcher, right? Like, and then people would say, well, because everyone loved my brother, people are not gonna believe me. So that was the thing, that was one of the things. The other one is like, well, it happened to other women in my family. So then I thought it was normal, Oh, there was one case, and this was really something. A woman from Mexico City going to college who had been having sexual relationships with her dad for a long time, and she thought it was normal until she went to talk to a counselor, and she learned about it, and the woman, I mean, she thought about committing suicide. And she said, I never talked to anyone because I thought it was normal. And she said, I didn't have sex with my boyfriend because I thought that with dad it's okay, but with boyfriend, no, I was supposed to be virgin, And I was like, wow. So I'm just thinking about my own ideas about virginity. And yes, but why people don't talk about it? So yes. So that's the book I would love to write on, understanding silence. So I've been reading, but I'm not there yet because I want to finish, the other book. But definitely that's something that I need to understand more. Why we are silent, why we're silent. But definitely, you hit me right there. Beautiful. Thank you. No, that's no.
A little hug.
Okay. No, well, take it back. Maybe it's not hit. You embraced me like right there. Thank you. No, thank you. No, that's perfect. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for this. This is really important research. I have two questions, I guess, about cultural narratives. So the first one is, when you talk about something that you say is in the culture, like the right to the first night, and it has this long history, I guess, has it come up in interviews with men you've identified as perpetrators, or how do you know that it's operative? And how would you know, I suppose, if they don't say it directly? And the second question made me think of Jeff Prager in the department has a book called Presenting the Past, which is, he's also a psychoanalyst, and he talks about how at a certain point there was a sort of moral panic about child sex abuse, and it started coming up with a lot of his clients, and where it was not entirely clear whether it's misremembering or remembering. And I guess I'm wondering about other cultural narratives about incest that people are drawing upon. And as you said, there wasn't a lot of empirical research, but if there are other things, movies or whatever, that people have drawn on that have shaped their memories.
Thank you. Wow. I have to take notes of these things. You know what I learned? I learned that as people were sharing the story, especially if they have never told the story, they were trying to make sense of the story as they were telling me the story. Does that make sense? So the interview was a really powerful experience because for the first time they are sharing with someone, and I became some kind of ethnographic mom, a symbolic mom who's finally listening, right? So I became a witness, I became an ethnographic mom who's finally listening, and I realized that people were making sense of their stories, their life experiences, as they were telling me all of this. So something that I learned also is that they would tell me, and I remember a particular case of someone, it was this woman from Mexico City who had, sustained sexual relationships with with dad, and then a cousin. She was sexually harassed by a cousin. And then she gave in, and she said, well, because and then when she's explaining all of this to me, she contradicted herself. And she says, well, now I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. And she said, now I'm kind of confused. And I go like, wow, this is so important, right? And I said, well, just take your time. And she said, you know what? My dad did all of that to me. And of course, at some point I realized it wasn't right. But then with my cousin, I think I gave in because it felt like that was normal, but I didn't want to do it. So as people are, and then they would say, and I don't remember that well. And I said, okay, just share whatever is okay with you. So I realized that the interview itself is a process of making sense of the experience. Does that make sense? And that's something, I haven't written about it. And that's something that I really need to get into. How people make sense of, their own experiences. And and then there's the syndrome, that people may feel like they are making up whatever. And someone confronted me once, actually told me, and why do you believe the women, or why do you believe? Well, I have to believe people. If someone is sharing a story and is crying and falling apart, I believe that. I work with the humanity of so someone told me that they were kind of reconstructing the story. It was kind of more postmodern kind of approach. And I said, you know what? I'm just listening to the person's testimony, and I go with what the person shares with me. So that's what I learned. That, articulating the story, sharing the story is part of making sense of the story, of the experience. Does that make sense? And then what was the other question?
It was about how, if you have some, as you said, you've identified this history of the right of the first night, but then how do you know whether or not that's in the minds, or even sort of unconsciously in the minds of the perpetrators?
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think that's a really good reflection, because I think that's that's kind of the conceptual tool that I have, and I have some testimonies that I am going to utilize as well to make sense of this, because there was another attorney that I interviewed who told me that he had been working with men who would tell them, and there was one particular case of this man who used to work with this attorney who sexually abused his daughter. And the rationale he gave was, well, I spent a lot of money in the education of my daughters to allow any asshole to come and have sex for the first time with her, being me the one who took care of them. So it's like, wow, this is out of the right of first night. So I have some, testimonies that justify that rationale. And in Chiapas, Mexico, and then in other places, we still have those practices, where men who own the land, they feel like they have the right to have sex for the first time if a woman in that small town is gonna get married. So we still have that, that's a practice. But that's a very good reflection. I appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
Well, on the topic of audiences, you were saying for the silence book, who might be the audience? I'm on faculty here as a nursing professor, associate professor in nursing, but I got trained as a psychotherapist, specifically to do research with women who are depressed, specifically second generation Latinas. And I think a huge audience who would really benefit from that book on silences would be both psychotherapists and patients, because all the concepts that you use, in addition to the silences, the concepts that you use, the surrogate, the marital slave, the heteropatriarch, these are, especially in cognitive therapy, they can be such powerful tools. The women that I worked with, one woman she immigrated to the States at like age 8, but she had been a victim of incest to her father in Mexico, came to the States, thought she'd be okay, but she was locked into her apartment by her mother with her 4 sisters. Cousin broke into the door and routinely would have sex with the girls. She was the oldest, felt that she needed to give herself to protect the others. And so years later, very depressed, suicidal, and having the tools of both your concepts, but also the silences could be so powerful in psychotherapy. So I hope you'll consider publishing in the healthcare literature. And that's one. And the second is to maybe create something that would be appropriate to use with lay language for patients that would tell these stories, because it's so empowering to realize, oh, someone else went through this, and their brother was a good lover, and they said that, and I hear myself in that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. Oh, because this is the feedback that helps me tremendously, you know, and that validates also what people told me, you know. The people I interviewed who said, who accepted also to be interviewed and to share their stories, because they hope that the book is going to be used to train professionals or to share with, you know, people who have gone through this. And but this is very validating, you know, and it would be great to get your contact information.
Good.
So thank you. Yes, Abby.
Hi. Just building directly on it, just a very small point. I mean, I think another audience, and it's hard to do sometimes because you have to be very quick, but you know, op-eds and the like. And I'm thinking of last summer when there exploded this transnational sex scandal involving Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and there was, of course, the talk of the housekeeper who did come forward and did, you know, who broke that silence, but there was also very quickly talk of the many victims in France, including a journalist who said something, but in the context of a talk show, and didn't formally complain until much later, and then didn't. And there was a lot of discussion of, well, why did she wait so long? Why didn't she say anything? And real misunderstanding of sexual violence and why people would become silent. And when those opportunities come up, I could see just a really powerful op-ed about the silence and why it makes sense.
Thank you. So yeah, wow. Oh. Yeah, I need to work on the book on silence. So this is so wonderful. You know, Christine Williams has this article on sexual harassment and women who wait at tables. And I teach that, you know, in my sociology of sexual violence. I have a grad seminar, sociology of sexual violence. And we learn how it's so difficult for someone to label, just to put the label, you know, this happened to me, and it's so challenging, you know, in terms of, you know, cognitively, emotionally. I mean, it's really intense. So if someone went through this, and you saw it in the families, exactly the same way, you know, it happened with this man, with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, that, you know, people told me, well, you know, when I realized that it happened to someone in my family, a cousin, and we're talking about it, we finally talked to my mom. So this is validation, you know, and again, the social organization of silence, you know, why people don't talk. And finally, until someone talks, then people say, oh, it happened to me, it happened to me, and it happened to me, right? So then all the girls in the family, finally, and maybe boys, you know, sharing. And then we see it again, you know, in the other context, you know, in terms of sexual harassment. It's just so interesting how organizations and families have a lot in common. So yeah, so thank you. Oh, thank you. Yes. Yes. Then Anthony, and then Ashi. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much for your presentation. My question was, I wanted to ask you more about how transnationalism fits. I was thinking about your example of the uncle who calls from America. And it sounds, when I hear that, I think about possible resources that he might have, sending remittances, access to networks, and how that might enhance the capacity of perpetrators to continue the abuse. But then that sounds more like it's exacerbating the abuse because of migration, but it's not causing the incest. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about the link between transnationalism or immigration and incest.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. These are really good reflections because the idea of transnational incest was something that I've been trying to make sense of. So I haven't gone in depth yet, but something that I think I would do is just to try to unpack all of the layers, and you're identifying some of them, some of the layers that are responsible for this kind of transnational incest. And something that I would have to do is to go back and interview, do more in-depth interviews with the attorneys who work, with these cases, and attorneys here on the American side. And I was thinking about some of those cases, because that in itself is something that deserves, special attention, especially in terms of the money. Like, you're identifying, the issue on money. And but then it's so interesting because if women get the money, you study all of this, the women who receive the remittances, then to what extent, does that relationship shape or make people vulnerable, which is what I am trying to explain. I'm coming more from the vulnerability, trying to understand vulnerability more than the cause and effect, because this is really complex. We know. And I'm trying to be also more sophisticated in terms of, how to understand this, because it's really complex. And just pointing the cause and effect, it simplifies something that has many layers. So the vulnerability, I think that's something that I'm trying to do. This would happen to me in very specific circumstances, but in other situations, it wouldn't happen to me. So then women become really savvy, really skillful how to survive, If someone is around, he wouldn't touch me, or or at some time of the day, So and this aspect of everyday life and incest, how people decipher, and survive. What women do, and it's just so remarkable. I mean, something that I'm trying to develop is this idea of resilience, how people become so resilient to all of this, and that's that's an article on resilience, and how I use the concept of sources of love. How people who offer all of this love and support become a protective factor, for people. And that's what I learned, from the interviews as well. But yes, I think I need to unpack, that's a really good, thank you for sharing that. I don't have a specific answer, because that's something, that's a question in itself, that's a research question. That would be wonderful for a master's thesis, if someone is interested. I could ask my students. So, is it okay? Oh, Anthony, Archie?
So, thank you. Your research is very interesting and fascinating. Having grown up in a town in Mexico, a very traditional place, this is just great making sense of all these ideas and concepts that you're putting together. And I can definitely see some parallels with some of the concepts like cultural helplessness and the socially organized silence with infidelity in Mexican couples. And basically they have the sayings, ojos que no ven, corazón que no siente, yes. Which is basically your husband is having affairs, but it's okay as long as you don't know. Or te tocó hueso, hueso comes, your husband is bad and he's basically like violent or whatever, but you're stuck with him. Yes. And so it makes sense how culture and the same family and society, and they basically reinforce that that cycle, which I've seen it happen. I grew up there for 15-16 years, and I cited my family, immediate family, cousins, uncles, and just neighbors. It's something that is very common, and I couldn't make sense of it, but now it's just coming together. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Archie. And it's highly prevalent. What has happened to me when I've given presentations and people are always so generous and receptive. people come to me and they ask me, they say, are you done with your interviews? And I said, yes, I did all my interviews. I would like to tell you my story. It has happened to me with colleagues, with academics who come to me. The other day, someone who's higher ranking at UT came to me and said, so what are you doing these days, woman? Your sexuality and your gender stuff. And I said, yeah, well, no, I'm doing research on this. I said, oh, okay. And then he said, I have a story to tell you. And I said, okay. So he's telling me the story about this boy and everything. And I go like, oh, that's so awful that boy went through all of that. And she said, well, that boy is next to you, and he's now a professor. Yeah, so it's so prevalent. It's so prevalent. It's so prevalent. It's so prevalent. It's so shocking. And again, the silence. The silence is, I mean, I'm going to have to read more about silence. And I know there's important books and publications and reflections of how to make sense of silence and why we're silent, especially in terms of these issues. But yeah, relationships and infidelity, all the stuff we don't talk about. It's just, isn't it something? Like yeah, it's just like backstage, front stage of the heart. Like we speak and then we stop and say. Right? It's interesting. Thank you, Archie. Anthony.
That'll be the last question.
Oh,
Sorry.
good. Okay.
So,
okay.
piggybacking on the idea that there's a genealogy to sexual violence or a genealogy to sexual violations, I know that your study was particular to Mexican society in different towns, but I couldn't help but see how much, as you noted, it resonated with other contexts with people, and it made me think of the context of the Philippines and how there are a lot of parallels in three particular ways. There's the priest having children, the incest within family, and then the broader definition of family and how that enables the sort of structural incest. And so I just wanted to throw out a question, your opinion about how maybe, the first thing I thought of when I thought Philippines is how much, whenever I read sociological work on Mexico, I always think, this is like how it goes in the Philippines, and how maybe colonialism provides a conceptual tool to understand these present day outcomes.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Yeah, all of this post-colonial and neo-colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial contexts, definitely is an important framework. In particular, something that I'm listening to you, Anthony, is how the law, the state has conceptualized incest. Like when I was doing research in Mexico and I was trying to, legally speaking, so what about the law, right? So that could be a way to wrap it up. So I read, the penal codes in different parts of Mexico, and I learned that the definition of incest is really short, is really brief, and people haven't done too much work with it. I mean, they have split, the concept of sexual violence. So there's been more concern about sexual violence in general, and if it has an incestuous connotation, that's the concept they use, then it has like an extra punishment. But then incest has been traditionally defined in these penal codes as a crime against the family. Isn't it something? It's a crime against the family. So then the one that is vulnerable is the family. We have to protect the family. Now there's el Día de la Familia in Mexico, the day of the family. So it's just as if we don't have enough, right? So now let's have a day. Let's have a day to celebrate the family, right? So then how, we have this big umbrella, all of these different nations that have the westernized, colonized nations, and how to make sense of this from this, post-coloniality, from all of these perspectives. That's a very good point. That's a very good reflection. And I think the idea of the state, how the state as well, the nation state and sexual violence, how these laws about sexual violence have been created and established. And by the way, in some places in Mexico, in some of the places where they have not updated the law Some men are much more likely to be punished with a really high sentence or a harsh sentence if they steal a cow than if they rape a woman. So feminists who are working on all of these, updating the law and making changes, they are trying to challenge, the patriarchal state and how these laws have overlooked, So there's one of the attorneys I interviewed is a highly influential feminist, and she told me, whenever you're ready, let me know, and so we can do some work at the policy making level. But that's something that is gonna have to happen along with the silence book. So, but this is wonderful. This idea of the looking at the ways in which all of this is happening in other countries or has happened in other countries that have this history of colonization, and so all of us are on the same boat, and but then in different ways, So thank you everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And so I'm in Austin.